The Rebus and the Complicity of origins were it a graphology. And even a graphology renewed and fertilized by sociology, history, ethnography, and psychoanalysis. Since individual markings reveal the particularities of the mind of those who write, the national markings should permit to a certain extent researches into the particularities of the collective mind of peoples. 36 Such a cultural graphology, however legitimate its project might be, can come into being and proceed with some certitude only when the more general and fundamental problems have been elucidated, as to the articulation of an individual and a collective graphic, of a graphic discourse so to speak, and the graphic code, considered not from the point of view of the intention of signification or of denotation, but of style and connotation, problems of the articulation of graphic forms and of diverse substances, of the diverse forms of graphic substances, materials, wood, wax, skin, stone, ink, metal, vegetable, or instruments, point, brush, etc., as to the articulation of the technical, economic, or historical levels, for example. At the moment when a graphic system is constituted and at the moment, which is not necessarily the same, when a graphic style is fixed, as to the limit and the sense of variations in style within the system, as to all the investitures to which a graphic, in form and substance, is submitted. From this latter point of view, a certain privilege should be given to research of the psychoanalytic type. Inasmuch as it touches the originary constitution of objectivity and of the value of the object, the constitution of good and bad objects as categories that do not allow themselves to be derived from a theoretical formal ontology and from a science of the objectivity of the object in general. Psychoanalysis is not a simple regional science, although, as its name indicates, it is presented under the heading of psychology. That it adheres to this title is certainly not a matter of indifference and hints at a certain state of criticism and epistemology. Nevertheless, even if psychoanalysis did not achieve the transcendentality under erasure of the RCHE trace, even if it remained a mundane science, its generality would have a controlling meaning with regard to all local science. Here I am quite obviously thinking of researches of the type undertaken by Melanie Klein. An example of it may be found in the essay on the role of the dot school in the libidinal development of the child 37, which evokes, from the clinical point of view, all the investments with which the operations of reading and writing, the production and management of the number, etc., are charged. To the extent that the constitution of ideal objectivity must essentially pass through the written signifier 38, no theory of this constitution has the right to neglect the investments of writing. These investments not only retain an opacity in the ideality of the object, but permit the liberation of that ideality. It gives the force without which an objectivity in general would not be possible. I do not dissimulate the gravity of such an affirmation and the immense difficulty of the task thus assigned to both the theory of objectivity and psychoanalysis. But the necessity is commensurate with the difficulty. It is in his very work that the historian of writing encounters this necessity. His problems cannot be grasped except at the root of all sciences. Reflection on the essence of mathematics, politics, economics, religion, technology, law, etc., communicates most intimately with the reflection upon and the information surrounding the history of writing. The continuous vein that circulates through all these fields of reflection and constitutes their fundamental unity is the problem of the phoneticization of writing. This phoneticization has a history, no script is absolutely exempt from it, and the enigma of this evolution does not allow itself to be dominated by the concept of history. To be sure, the latter appears at a determined moment in the phoneticization of script, and it presupposes phoneticization in an essential way. On this subject, what does the most massive, most recent, and least contestable information teach us? First, that for structural or essential reasons, a purely phonetic writing is impossible and has never finished reducing the non-phonetic. The distinction between phonetic and non-phonetic writing, although completely indispensable and legitimate, of grammatology as a positive science means very derivative with regard to what may be called a synergy and a fundamental synesthesia. It follows that not only has phoneticization never been omnipotent but also that it has always already begun to undermine the mute signifier. Phonetic and non-phonetic are therefore never pure qualities of certain systems of writing, they are the abstract characteristics of typical elements, more or less numerous and dominant within all systems of signification in general. Their importance owes less to their quantitative distribution than to their structural organization. The cuneiform, for example, is at the same time ideogrammatic and phonetic. And, indeed, one cannot say that each graphic signifier belongs to such and such a class, the cuneiform code playing alternately on two registers. In fact, each graphic form may have a double value, ideographic and phonetic. And its phonetic value can be simple or complex. The same signifier may have one or various phonic values, it may be homophonic or polyphonic. To this general complexity of the system is added yet another subtle recourse to categorical determinatives, to phonetic complements useless in reading, to a very irregular punctuation. And Labat shows that it is impossible to understand the system without going through its history. 39 This is true of all systems of writing and does not depend upon what is sometimes hastily considered to be levels of elaboration. Within the structure of a pictographic tale, for example, a representation of a thing, such as a totemic blazon, may take the symbolic value of a proper name. From that moment on, it can function as appellation within other series with a phonetic value. 40 Its stratification may thus become very complex and go beyond the empirical consciousness linked to their immediate usage. Going beyond this real consciousness, the structure of the signifier may continue to operate not only on the fringes of the potential consciousness but according to the causality of the unconscious. Thus the name, especially the so-called proper name, is always caught in a chain or a system of differences. It becomes an appellation only to the extent that it may inscribe itself within a figuration. Whether it be linked by its origin to the representations of things in space or whether it remains caught in a system of phonic differences or social classifications apparently released from ordinary space, the properness of the name does not escape spacing. Metaphor shapes and undermines the proper name. The literal proper meaning does not exist, its appearance is a necessary function and must be analyzed as such in the system of differences and metaphors. The absolute parousia of the literal meaning, as the presence to the self of the logos within its voice, in the absolute hearing itself speak, should be situated as a function responding to an indestructible but relative necessity, within a system that encompasses it. That amounts to situating the metaphysics or the ontotheology of the logos. The problem of the picture puzzle, Rebus a transferred, brings together all the difficulties. As pictogram, a representation of the thing may find itself endowed with a phonetic value. This does not efface the pictographic reference which, moreover, has never been simply realistic. The signifier is broken or constellated into a system, it refers at once, and at least, to a thing and to a sound. The thing is itself a collection of things or a chain of differences in space. The sound, which is also inscribed within a chain, may be a word. The inscription is then ideogrammatical or synthetic. It cannot be decomposed, but the sound may also be an atomic element itself entering into the composition. We are dealing then with a script apparently pictographic and in fact phonetico-analytical in the same way as the alphabet. What is now known of the writing of the Aztecs of Mexico seems to cover all these possibilities. Thus the proper name Teocaltitlan is broken into several syllables, rendered by the phonoing images, lips, tenth, road, oach limb, house, cali, and finally tooth, TLA.NTI. The procedure is closely bound up with that of suggesting the name of a person by images of the beings or things that go into the making of his name. The Aztecs achieved a greater degree of phoneticism. By having recourse to a truly phonetic analysis, they succeeded in rendering separate sounds through images. The work of Barthel and Norisov * on the Enlil glyphs do not lead to harmonious results. Their progress remains very slow, but the presence of phonetic elements now seems almost certain. And the same is true of the writing of the Easter Islands. 42. Not only is the latter pictoidiophonographic, but in the very interior of its non-phonetic structures, equivocity and overdetermination can give rise to metaphors taken over by a true graphic rhetoric, if this absurd expression may be risked. We shall now discover the complexity of this structure in the so-called primitive scripts and in cultures believed without writing. But we have known for a long time that largely non-phonetic scripts like Chinese or Japanese included phonetic elements very early. They remain structurally dominated by the ideogram or algebra, and we thus have the testimony of a powerful movement of civilization developing outside of all logocentrism. Writing did not reduce the voice to itself, it incorporated it into a system. This script had more or less recourse to phonetic borrowings, certain signs being used for their sound independently of their original meaning. But this phonetic asterisk for Thomas S. Barthel, see note 4.2. Among the many works by I.U. V. Norisov on the Maya script are Kratky Idagi Isosinejadurvnich Pis Men Ostimach Yavi Sovietskom Sojus, / a short survey of the study of the ancient Maya script of the Soviet Union / Sesko-Lavinska Ethnographiae, Praha, 4, 1956, 309 Silikot Ka, New Data on the Mayan Written Language, Journal de la Société Americanists, Nouvelle Syria, Paris, 1956, pp_20917, Le Problème du déchiffrement de l'écriture Maya, Diog, Me 40, 1962, 121228. Of grammatology as a positive science, use of signs could never become extensive enough to corrupt Chinese writing in principle and lead it onto the path of phonetic notation. Writing in China, never having reached a phonetic analysis of language, was never felt to be a more or less faithful transference technique of speech, and that is why the graphic sign, symbol of a reality singular and unique like itself, has retained much of its primitive prestige. There is no reason for believing that in antiquity speech in China had not the same efficaciousness as writing, but it was possible for its power to have been partly eclipsed by writing. On the contrary, in civilizations where writing evolved towards syllabification and the alphabet early enough, it is the word which concentrated in itself, definitively, all the powers of religious and magical creation. And in fact it is remarkable that in China this strange valorization of speech, word, syllable, or vowel, attested in all great ancient civilizations from the L/1 Mediterranean basin to India, is not encountered. Why it is difficult not to subscribe to this analysis globally. Let us note, however, that it seems to consider the phonetic analysis of language and phonetic writing as a normal outcome, as an historical telos within sight of which, like a ship steering to port, Chinese script had to an extent run aground. Can it be thought that the system of Chinese script is thus a sort of unfulfilled alphabet? On the other hand, Journet seems to explain the primitive prestige of Chinese graphism by its symbolic relationship with a reality singular and unique like itself. Is it not evident that no signifier, whatever its substance and form, has a unique and singular reality? A signifier is from the very beginning the possibility of its own repetition, of its own image or resemblance. It is the condition of its ideality, what identifies it as signifier, and makes it function as such, relating it to a signified which, for the same reasons, could never be a unique and singular reality. From the moment that the sign appears, that is to say from the very beginning, there is no chance of encountering anywhere the purity of reality, unicity, singularity. So by what right can it be supposed that speech could have had, in antiquity, before the birth of Chinese writing, the sense and value that we know in the West? Why would speech in China have had to be eclipsed by writing? If one wishes really to penetrate to the thing that, under the name of writing, separates much more than techniques of notation, should one not get rid, among other ethnocentric presuppositions, also of a sort of graphic monogenetism that transforms all differences into divergences or delays, accidents or deviations? And examine this heliocentric concept of speech, as well as the resemblance of the logos to the sun, to the good or to the death that one cannot look at face to face, to the king or to the father, the good or the intelligible son are compared to the father in the Republic, 508 c. What must writing be in order to threaten this analogical system in its vulnerable and secret center? What must it be in order to signify the eclipse of what is good and of the father? Should one not stop considering writing as the eclipse that comes to surprise and obscure the glory of the word? And if there is some society of eclipse, the relationship of shadow and light, of writing and speech, should it not itself appear in a different way? In a different way, the necessary dissenting cannot be a philosophic or scientific act as such, since it is a question of dislocating, through access to another system linking speech and writing, the founding categories of language and the grammar of the episteme. The natural tendency of theory of what unites philosophy and science in the episteme will push rather toward filling in the breach than toward forcing the closure. It was normal that the breakthrough was more secure and more penetrating on the side of literature and poetic writing, normal also that it, like Nietzsche, at first destroyed and caused to vacillate the transcendental authority and dominant category of the episteme, being. This is the meaning of the work of Penelissa 44, whose influence upon Ezra Pound and his poetics is well known. This irreducibly graphic poetics was, with that of Mallarmé, the first break in the most entrenched Western tradition. The fascination that the Chinese ideogram exercised on Pound's writing may thus be given all its historical significance. Ever since phoneticization has allowed itself to be questioned in its origin, its history, and its adventures, its movement is seen to mingle with that of science, religion, politics, economy, technics, law, art. The origins of these movements and these historical regions dissociate themselves, as they must for the rigorous delimitation of each science, only by an abstraction that one must constantly be aware of and use with vigilance. This complicity of origins may be called archie-writing. What is lost in that complicity is therefore the myth of the simplicity of origin. This myth is linked to the very concept of origin, to speech reciting the origin, to the myth of the origin and not only to myths of origin. The fact that access to the written sign assures the sacred power of keeping existence operative within the trace and of knowing the general structure of the universe, that all clear these, exercising political power or not, were constituted at the same time as writing and by the disposition of graphic power, that strategy, ballistics, diplomacy, agriculture, fiscally, and penal law are linked in their history and in their structure to the constitution of writing, that the origin assigned to writing had been according to the chains and my themes always analogous in the most diverse cultures, and that it communicated in a complex but regulated manner with the distribution of political power as with familial structure, that the possibility of capitalization and of politico-administrative organization had always passed through the hands of scribes who laid down the terms of many wars and whose function was always irreducible, whoever the contending parties. might be, that through discrepancies, inequalities of development, the play of grammatology as a positive science 9-3 of permanencies, of delays, of diffusions, etc., the solidarity among ideological, religious, scientific technical systems, and the systems of reasoning which were therefore more and other than means of communication or vehicles of the signified, remains indestructible, that the very sense of power and effectiveness in general, which could appear as such, as meaning and mastery, by idealization, only with so-called symbolic power, was always linked with the disposition of writing, that economy, monetary or premonetary, and graphic calculation were co-originary, that there could be no law without the possibility of trace, if not, as H. Levy-Bruhl shows, of notation in the narrow sense. All this refers to a common and radical possibility that no determined science, no abstract discipline, can think as such. Point 45. Indeed, one must understand this incompetence of science, which is also the incompetence of philosophy, the closure of the episteme. Above all, it does not invoke a return to a prescientific or infraphilosophic form of discourse. Quite the contrary. This common root, which is not a root but the concealment of the origin, and which is not common because it does not amount to the same thing except with the unmonotonous insistence of difference, this unamiable movement of difference itself, that I have strategically nicknamed trace, reserve, or difference, could be called writing only within the historical closure, that is to say within the limits of science and philosophy. The constitution of a science or a philosophy of writing is a necessary and difficult task. But, a thought of the trace, of difference, or of reserve, having arrived at these limits and repeating them ceaselessly, must also point beyond the field of the episteme. Outside of the economic and strategic reference to the name that Heidegger justifies himself in giving to an analogous but not identical transgression of all philosophemes, thought is here for me a perfectly neutral name, the blank part of the text, the necessarily indeterminate index of a future epoch of difference. In a certain sense, thought means nothing. Like all openings, this index belongs within a past epoch by the face that is open to view. This thought has no weight. It is, in the play of the system, that very thing which never has weight. Thinking is what we already know we have not yet begun, measured against the shape of writing, it is broached only in the episteme. Grammatology, this thought, would still be walled in within presence.